Hi, everyone, and welcome to the third and last session of Interact Amsterdam Virtual Conference 2023. Up next, we have Alberto Ferreira, who is a service design lead at Lloyds Bank Group, with his talk, When Micro Meets Macro, exploring the connection between research UX and service design. Based on Alberto's experience forming and nurturing UX research and service design teams in big corporations, in this talk, Alberto will walk us through some of the key principles that guided his work in the past, and he will elaborate on how his teams adopted service design principles to push for a more coherent delivery of user experience. Please join in the discussion in the chat. Make sure your chat settings are switched to everyone, not hosts and panelists, so that everyone can see your messages. And if you have any questions, you can submit them in using the Q&A function, and I will get through as many as I can at the end. We are using auto-generated captions from Rev today. There's a chance some of these may get a bit muddled live, as it's the nature of auto-generated captions, but we'll make sure these are tidied up when we post the recording on our YouTube channel. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Alberto to kicking things off.
Thank you, Manuel, and thank you to Nomensa for the invitation for this event, and hi, everybody. So the talk title is quite ambitious, and obviously in just 1 hour, we won't have enough time to touch on all aspects around this, but hopefully we'll be getting into the real core messages of the talk and sharing a little bit of my experience and what was learned effectively in the course of these projects around the integration of service design into big orgs and how that takes research and UX in tandem in terms of the approaches. So just very quickly about myself, I have over 10 years of experience in UX and research in various domains, various industries. There's been some common threads that I've observed over the time that I've worked with big companies, and also in terms of the background that I come from. So it's a bit all over the place, but this is something that basically has progressively converged into being more closely related to design, where the real action for the users actually takes place. And so in terms of the overall notion of service design, it's really the issue that we find ourselves in is that the practice itself is really mature, and using the double diamond for service design purposes is a standardized framework that has been used for and is being used for everything from designing shoes to designing hospital services. And there are some common aspects to how the approach is actually held for service design that need to be thought of in a very specific way. So the double diamond has been introduced as one of the key frameworks for service design, and for a long time, service design and design thinking have been thought of in almost the same kind of sphere. So basically belonging to the same domain. Design thinking being a more general approach, but service design bringing it into focus, into an iterative kind of approach. And so the two go hand in hand, but effectively there are some aspects of service design that now we have to also debunk a little bit in order to understand how to move forward with service design. So what is the problem statement around the practice of service design itself? I would bring it back to thinking a little bit about what innovation means. So one of the key missions and one of the key objectives of service design is to facilitate innovative solutions for organizations and to actually evolve processes and services with an innovative lens by understanding people and by using data in a collaborative way. But innovation has become a little bit of a dirty word, almost cringy, in the sense that it's being used for so many different domains, so many different applications, and it can lose its meaning really if it's used too much in the context of an environment that doesn't necessarily work on innovation as part of its main function. So, for example, a company that has a very stable set of products might be innovating in tech or might be innovating in different aspects of the back end, but innovation quite often is placed as something that is visible or something that has a significant impact that the end consumer can actually see. That's not always the case, and especially for companies that use the term in a very loose way. So in going and defining innovation as per the UK Innovation Survey report, so for 2021, innovation basically refers back to new or significantly improved products or processes, engagement in innovation projects, and forms of organization, business structures, or practices. And this is quite interesting because what the report basically places innovation as is not only is it about products, but it can also be about processes and ways of doing things. So this is really an interesting aspect of where service design can actually be a tool to optimize not just a certain output, but also the way that people collaborate and the way that people use these kinds of design practices in the organization itself. And we have to face the reality as well that innovation, even for an organization that is very forward thinking, the bigger the organization is, the harder it is to enact change, the harder it is to enact fast change in particular. Of course, you can make radical decisions, but it's not necessarily going to have an immediate impact in what the company is actually producing for the end customer. A massive effort has to be done from all sides, both in terms of the backstage and the front stage and all the services that come into play in an organization to actually make something different for the customer from what they have been presenting. So unless there is a massive effort, change is going to be slow. And teams in particular, when they are told, so for example, delivery teams are told to use design thinking methods or approaches, quite often in the delivery side of the spectrum, they are pressured from two sides. One is that obviously with agile practices, they have to deliver. They have sprint-based objectives. So that means that the outputs need to be there. They need to be achieved in a time-boxed manner, and they have to be predictable as well. So altogether, not leaving a lot of room for experimentation and ideation and making new and different solutions that could well fail, but bring learning into the team. So this is a traditional tension in between what we are delivering is the priority that keeps the company running, but at the same time, we want to also bring innovation and innovative thinking, but that needs to also be carved out and having a protected sphere of application within the company. And this also leads to another conversation about the design industry in general. So in particular, if we think about the last few years, so there's been no shortage of opportunities to actually change dramatically the way that we work. So in terms of, for example, when the pandemic took place about 3 years ago, and we're still feeling the repercussions of that, but at the time it was companies did position themselves mostly the ones that kept working with that kind of economic pressure. That this would lead to new hybrid ways of working, that people will be more demanding about the conditions of their work with the company. So having more flexible time, having more remote opportunities as well, and effectively that this would HR in particular and people departments found that as a good opportunity to also analyze how do people work and how do people actually collaborate, and moving forward, what kind of changes could actually be brought as a positive outcome of becoming more, in a way, employee-centric. What we found since then has not been exactly the revolutionary change that we anticipate in terms of productivity in particular. So there was an immediate, so if you check, for example, the proxy for productivity growth on the right, and the bump happened. So after the initial dip in 2020, it came back up in terms of productivity, and this is really based on indices and statistics gathered from the companies themselves. But then the productivity went down again, and that also came into play. So basically, there was an initial surge of interest and renewed vigor. The processes were changing, people were adapting. There was more of a positive aspect to actually being more flexible with remote working. And then progressively, the productivity index started to slip, and especially in the remote positions. And so this doesn't quite indicate that we've managed to find a new way of working that was inclusive, that made sure that everybody had the right tools, and that everybody felt included and represented in the workplace as well. And so with these opportunities, we have to also acknowledge that in terms of the innovation aspect, the design industry has grown by leaps and bounds in the last few years. So we're almost at a stage where the design industry at large has over 100 billion pounds worth in the UK. Extending the definition of design activities, almost 1 in 20 workers in the UK work in some way in a design related activity. So why aren't these big solutions and these life-changing propositions coming through? Why aren't we actually having better solutions for improving our well-being and improving our lives? And that again speaks to the fact that companies themselves need to also change. It's not just going to be about the habits. It's not just going to be about the way that we use certain methods and approaches. It's also a matter of, do we have the right environment, the right context, and our company is able to actually propose and maintain those for their workers. So that's the key for innovation. So a quick change can have an immediate impact, but then it's about diffusion, it's about sustainability, it's about maintaining that drive. And that's something that can only be done with a consistent approach and not just pushing from one side. So specifically, when thinking about service design teams and UX teams, they're often told that their role is in some way connected to innovation, that innovation is one of the key drivers for design people in the company. And quite often that doesn't happen in that way, even when there is a mission statement, for example, for iterative development. So for instance, there's always a tendency in iterative development processes, and that would be flavors of agile and different ways of implementing iterative work that steer more towards optimization rather than innovation. And a lot of companies then take a step back and basically say, well, let's have a team devoted to actually coming up with R&D solutions, innovating, and that's also a possibility. But again, it's not something that's a mindset then that's applied to the whole company, and it's very easy to establish silos in that way. So this is really about the company and the way that companies in particular use service design and research and UX in the process of achieving better solutions and better services. And it's one of the things that service designers and teams in general need to handle is trying to minimize bias from the stakeholders towards certain solutions, trying to counter the aspects of this might be a great solution, but we don't have any data necessarily to support that. So let's research on that and bring it to the table. These are conversations that quite often had, because the maturity level might not be there, but also there is a tendency towards let's fast track some changes instead of thinking about the longer term sustainability of them. And so this is really something that I'm sure everybody on the call has dealt with in one way or another. There are multiple approaches, but basically I'm just going to go through some of the ones that we've in my teams have used over the years in terms of how to cope and try to instigate organizational change that supports that kind of thinking. So there are a number of frameworks as well that start that can be used together with design thinking. And design thinking is not just by itself enough necessarily to have a unique approach. So of course you can use aspects of lean UX. Of course you can have aspects of basic UX, which is another framework that has been proposed in the meantime. Peter Morville developed the UX honeycomb, which is much more around making the products according to a certain list of characteristics, and basically making them useful, usable, desirable, and measuring them on that basis. And so even if you're at the start of the journey and not using design thinking necessarily at the moment, but you want to start having those kinds of workshops and being much more closer to the stakeholders, I would always say there's plenty of basis materials that you can use, but use something that is adapted to the company and especially to its culture. And that's going to be sometimes colored by compromise, but it's going to be the right solution in the longer term to try and, instead of instigating something that is not necessarily adaptive to the target audience, but something that actually speaks to what is already expected and known, but also brings that element of change. So there are plenty of different resources to actually help you with that, and different frameworks as well. And this is really where you can feel a bit confused. So there are plenty of opportunities, plenty of frameworks. So which one is right for me? How do I actually pick something that I can start with? And so in looking at the, and that was basically the question that I myself and my teams have also posed over the years in different companies, has always been around, well, what is it that we can actually use to bring an element of new, fresh thinking, more data-led, more grounded, and more user-centric or more human-centric. And it helped throughout the last few years to use the double diamond as a start, and basically thinking about the different phases. So discover, define, design, and deliver, and use them basically to earmark phases of understanding and then of designing for a specific product, and not necessarily integrating delivery into the double diamond at first. So we wanted basically to make sure that also these processes were iterative. And then the challenge that we have is that obviously there are multiple different versions of the double diamond across the board, and there are multiple different ways that you can color them. So again, it's a matter of finding something that works for your team, whilst having that as a basic framework of understanding the problem, defining the problem, making sure that you're also having a clear ideation that is data-led around it, and then that there is a specific solution coming out of it that's tactical, but also speaks to the strategic needs of the company. So in several ways, the revised double diamond would speak to that. So basically in having a combination of this iterative process where the discovery is held in the first couple of phases, so discover, define, and then going to design and deliver. But apologies for the fonts being out of sync here. And then in terms of what else we can actually integrate, so making sure that when we actually apply that process, that we're taking into account design principles, that we're taking into account the culture, and that we're also having a very concrete approach with different methods that are understood by the teams. And that's the key element to using any kind of service design approach is that your team might be the subject matter experts, they might be the senior and dedicated people to that practice, but it's not going to work in the organization unless other people understand what it's good for, what value can it bring, and how they themselves can actually apply it. And it's very important for it to be people-centered, but by people-centered, not just in terms of the data and the outputs, but also the people that are involved in it, the actual stakeholders, the teams that are actually going to use the outputs of it. It's the best way to build acceptance and also to make sure that the work has consequence. And that's really one of the other points around the double diamond, is that it can be very problem-centric. It's very much around, we have a challenge, we're going to explore what does the data tell us about this challenge, what kind of resources we have around that, and then defining a specific solution. And it's very linear in that. And that's something as well that doesn't necessarily work for every team and every company. Sometimes you need a more iterative approach. Maybe the challenge isn't necessarily let's develop a new feature or let's work on improving this part of the product, but the challenge could actually be, how do we think better about our customers' needs? And that can eventually be as well going through this process. And that's something that you would want to take up iteratively as well. So it's very important not to think of the double diamond or any framework as just a linear model that just has an input and has an output. And basically we go through this set of activities in order to reach something, and only that, because that might work for that solution, that might work for that problem, but it's not going to guarantee that in the future there's more engagement around that form of thinking, that there's more concern about change, which is effectively what in this kind of approach service design is more about. So in being inclusive, in thinking about the double diamond, effectively, there's elements that we cannot ignore. So things like the strategy and the vision, and sometimes they can be in low availability mode as well. It depends on the company and how clear the company is around their objectives. But having the sense of what's the roadmap like for the next 12, 24 months, having an idea of what's the overall vision, it's very important. And if it's not there, if you're in a kind of environment where that is not clear, then it's doubly important to ask those questions at the very beginning. So the vision can be quite, it can be very precise, very specific. It can be around KPIs, can be about OKRs. So we have to reach these ones. But I would say that vision is something that is not necessarily time boxed, but is much more around which direction is this ship sailing in. It's much more around, these are tenets, this is what we're aiming for in the next few years. And for that, even, for example, in projects where my teams didn't necessarily have a vision statement that they could work with, that's a workshop in itself, in getting the senior leaders, getting the stakeholders to actually articulate what their expectations are, and that bringing it together into some form of statement. And it doesn't have to be like the company's de facto vision statement, but something that contextualizes what this work that we'll be doing is for. And that's key really at the very beginning. And so the service design teams can help a lot with that, but also just even if, regardless of whether you're a UX designer, a researcher, a service designer, or in whatever capacity you work in design, it's important to ask those questions and to have some kind of idea about, this is what the company is after. And it might be just, we want more sales. That's fine. But how? And is the product lineup, whatever we're offering, the services, is that going to stay the same, or do we want to actually adopt new and investigate new ways of achieving that goal? So if yes, then that's part of a statement. That's part of the vision. So this is what we're aiming for. So it's not necessarily always an easy conversation to have. It's not always there, but strategy and vision should inform how you start your iterative process around the double diamond anyway. The other thing as well is culture and relationships. Incredibly important. The culture itself needs to provide a nurturing environment, but at the very least, you can obviously grow a design function or a research function or a service design function in isolation, and you can build a team and get it to work pretty well within those confines. But again, it's not going to have the sustainability to it unless more elements in the business, and particularly around product, take it on and start implementing and start using those services in an integrated way. So the key message there is that the relationships are important, the culture is important, and you can influence the culture slowly by building all the relationships. And it's always around trying to find who can be our champions, who would be people that would be receptive to this. And of course, you will always have resistant parts, let's say, but it's very important to try and find the people in the business that can help protect and help build that approach. And again, it's about time as well. One thing that this also incorporates is the framing and the monitoring. So in particular, there are always conversations around the ROI and what does that represent in terms of design. Well, I'll go into it in a second, but the biggest attraction in using this kind of approach is that you can set up outputs that can be measured because they're being designed with a specific audience and for a specific set of channels and for a specific delivery. And measuring the ROI of design is like measuring the ROI of project management or QA services. It has to be in the product development cycle in order for the product to actually have the quality that it needs at the end. But there are ways that the ROI can, or at least the metrics can be discussed. And I'll go into that in a second. The other aspect that is very important is the mindset in the process. Like I said, the mindset and in the environment is important, but also the process itself should be flexible. So sometimes you won't have 8 weeks to do discovery work. You will have 2, or you will have a project where maybe another team, for example, if it's a new product, maybe another team, maybe in marketing, maybe in a different side of the company has already started some work doing the research. That can be a way to shorten your time as well. So by using the knowledge that's already been gathered, and to build bridges as well. And we all know, obviously, that that's also very important, is to make sure that the teams that you're collaborating with try to overcome any possible office politics by actually focusing on what is it that we're working on and what is it that we're working for, and bringing and sharing as much of the knowledge as possible. So it's not always linear there as well, but the important thing is to try and build the bridges and try to include as many actors in the business as possible, so that the process itself has to remain flexible, but it's also inclusive. And so in terms of the overall phases and what this encompasses for example, for the last few environments where I've worked, it's always been around having an initial stage of synthesizing research, and also building the research might already exist, but also prioritizing new research, whatever the needs would be. and also understanding what kind of what is the project for. So who is it aimed at? What scenarios are encompassed in it? What are the key journeys that are affected? And this might be, in a mature environment, you would have pretty much these elements already sorted. But if you're starting out, then it's a matter of basically asking who is the target customer, the persona that we're going to be building for example, and who is and that doesn't mean that it's an external customer. It could be an internal customer. So, for example, in my current position, I'm basically working for the employees, so the workplace experience. But other than that, the needs and the approaches are very similar in the sense that we're basically building something for people to use. So we need to know how people actually use those services, but also what the needs are, what the pain points are, and how can we leverage the knowledge that we have to optimize those. So the prioritization and understanding what the journey is currently and what the vision for the journey would be. And it's always very journey centric in the sense that this is what our customer effectively goes through in order to achieve a certain objective, to do something. And that's something as well that is important to agree at the very beginning with the stakeholders, making sure that we understand this is what we're designing for. It's a set of actions to get an output, and one of our customers is going to go through this, and this is the progression of what they're going to do. So it's very important to have a view of what are currently the main pain points and what are the possible pain points that we're going to have in this new solution. And the to-be journey is effectively a linear map of how that's going to look like or could look like in the new solution, and then basically designing the materials around that. The other thing as well is never to forget that it's very easy to be focusing on the front end. So basically what is shown to the customer, and not and forget or not pay as much attention to the backstage part. So what is the underlying tech stack that makes that experience possible? And in some ways, and this has different schools of thought, in some ways, for some cases, you want to take that feasibility aspect into account from the very beginning. In other aspects, you don't want necessarily to be constrained by what's already there, and you want to find an ideal experience, and then you break it down from there and kind of find what's feasible from it. And this is something, again, that has to do with the environment and what the teams are delivering. So what is possible to actually be done. So you either focus on building an ideal, perfect utopian experience that works exactly like the customer wants, and then just start assessing what compromises need to be done with the current tech stack, or you just take that into account from the beginning and you come up with a solution that's much more narrow but more feasible. And I found that different projects will work differently, and it's important in both cases never to lose sight of, in any case, what's the best that we can do for the customer right now, but also in the future. So what is it that we're aiming for right now, but what is it that we can do to make this actually a continuing and developing and evolving experience for them? So again, it's not about being stuck in one way of doing things. There are advantages to both approaches. It's just that you have to be equating basically which fits in that project with those teams that you're working with. So research itself, what is the value? So these are all very nice approaches and models on processes and how to actually iterate on the design. But what role does research play in this? So one of the things that I've always maintained in every company is that service design cannot work without research of some kind supporting it. And in some companies that might take the place of analytics and big data. They can have more analysts working from a research perspective, or they can have an actual set team of user researchers that are just focused on more of the UX and the overall experience side. And one way or another, the data needs to be there, because there is always this aspect of we don't know exactly what the customer is actually thinking, what they need. And there is a need for companies also to start looking more into being more participatory. So for example, one of the things that has been always focused on, and not always from a sustainability perspective in the past, has always been that the more options, the better. So the more options the company gives or a service provides to the customer, the better. And throughout the years, we found that that's not always true. In fact, it's only true in a very small portion of cases, because it's not always more options brings more engagement. More options might bring more cognitive load, more difficulty in choosing, and the confidence of the customer and the trust in the service are going to suffer with that. So these are only things that you can find and that you can measure and actually discover by using research to actually talk directly to the customers in some way. And by talk, it can be interviews, it can be workshops. Obviously, there are different methods of doing that. We'll go through that in a bit in a second. But it's always important to make sure that there is that dialogue with the customer beyond just the internal, let's say, dialogue about what is already known. So one of the challenges, though, that we have around that is that research typically plays really well into the discover and define phases for Double Diamond. So for example, these statistics were drawn out by the New Zealand's government about the value of design in the economy. And by and large, for the entire workforce that was working in any company that had design activities, discover and define only had a very small part of the employee force that was actually devoted to those phases. Most efforts were focused on the development side. And so it's really also a consequence of the research itself becoming more and more about validation in these kinds of environments. So especially with development teams, research is seen quite often as just testing. So just basically getting a general sentiment or some insights around how does this play out, how does this work for the end user, and what kind of experience are they having at the moment, and not necessarily going into what is it that we can actually respond to in terms of their needs. What is this journey that brought them there? And so this is also a challenge for research, but without research involved in the process, then you always run the risk of just focusing on the delivery and the development side, rather than trying to understand what is the key problem from the very beginning that we're actually trying to work for, and what is it that we're trying to help the end customer with. And so another factor that also ends up influencing the need for research is the fact that a service, in particular for something that is delivered as a service, is not about predictability, but it's about strategic understanding with the data to push more iterations. So you can't possibly, I would basically say that research isn't just happening before and during the product development. I think research also is about after the product is out, how is it performing? How is it actually helping the customers in fulfilling what they want to do? And so research in that sense cannot be just about, well, we're bringing user research in the beginning and they helped with the design, they validated the design, and then once it's out, it's out of their hands. It's basically gone on to analytics. I would strongly say that analytics, at the very least, should work very closely with research, if not be part of the same kind of insights unit. And for mature organizations, this should be the end game. But in other situations, it's very important to always have a sense of what's happening once the product is out the door, what's happening when the experience is out there. And that's always a cycle for research in itself. And so a service cannot be designed well, it cannot perform well without having research helping with the first part of the design and helping to monitor the quality of its output. And that's something that I think a lot of organizations learn the hard way, but it's important to really put it into context that good service design cannot exist unless they're part of the same cycle. And so this is all part of the two key things that research can help with the vision and the context, and it can also help with the solution framing and monitoring. And it's very important to bring people along that journey. And this applies to the double diamond as it could apply to any other framework. The key thing is really that there's data at the beginning, there's data at the end, and in the middle, we make good use of that data to design better products. So the key value of service design really is to try to eliminate things that are developed in isolation. Let's try to bring a unifying view to how a product development cycle works or a service design development works. And it's key to understanding the context. It's key to actually make sure that there's a vision behind it, even if it isn't the definitive company vision, but it's the vision for that product. It's a vision for that service, and making sure that it is close to what people actually need. So I mentioned ROI, and I'll just go very quickly through this. ROI is often put unfairly onto designers as something that needs to be proven. So what's the ROI of design? What's the ROI of research? How is the money that the company is investing actually coming across in terms of what you're doing? And to have that conversation on a very specific level, the ROI shouldn't be about justifying the existence of a design unit. It's the same thing as I mentioned, talking about project management or QA. They're essential to the cycle, because you cannot have something that is designed for somebody without having design behind it. And to have design behind it, you need to have both the context to have that design. So that's the research that takes place at the beginning of the design process, and also the monitoring that goes along with it. So the actual analytics that come out at the end and are about how successful it is. So the ROI at the end of the day is really a conversation about how are we tracking the success of this initiative, product, service. And that's when you need to pick basically which dimensions are you going to go into. Is it the performance from a click perspective? Is it engagement? Is it conversion? Is it efficiency? And companies usually have a very strict, especially more e-commerce driven, but companies in general effectively want to see more engagement also in conversion to the fore. But there are multiple ways that this can happen. You might be working in support services, for example, in which case it's obviously not about conversion. It's more about satisfaction. It's more about how do people see the support services at the end. So the key thing as well is to distinguish between what is a metric, what is a measure, and what is a measurement. So in a lot of ways, a metric should be a relation between two measures. So basically saying how many people did this, and that this being the measure. And the measurement is the data that comes through from whatever system to give you the numbers effectively. And so, for example, a very simple way of drawing up a metric is just thinking about the quantity. So what is the percentage of, what's the average, what is the number of, and then the signals themselves. So what is it that the data that we're tracking? Is it clicks? Is it bounce rates, time on page? Is it purchases? What is the actual numeric value that we're measuring? And then giving it a time frame. So is it over the last month, over the last week? And that's going to be important, because then drawing up a benchmark is going to be the measure of success for that. And also having the scope. So is it applicable to a page level? Is it applicable to a journey, which is quite difficult, but doable if you work with your analytics team to actually assuming that the analytics are in place, which in some cases are not, but that doesn't mean necessarily that you can't have that tracked in some way. So you can set up user research sessions, basically testing and surveys to actually track satisfaction in different ways. So you have multiple tools in most cases, and it's always about working with what you have available, but always asking specific questions, and specifically for the ROI, metrics are essential. So just to remember there that a good metric should be valid, should be relative to a time period, and it is meant to be benchmarked over time. And it can focus on the behavior or attitude, but it shouldn't be both. So you can't ask, so you can't combine how many clicks somebody did with how satisfied they were at the end in the same metric. It's two different metrics, and of course then you can compare and you can see if they correlate, but it's not going to be the same metric. It's going to be two different ones. And in terms of just the help that research can provide, so it's very important to also understand that there's an emotional aspect to the research, an empathy aspect that it can bring into projects. And sometimes it's very important to also understand that it's very easy to say that human behavior can be predicted in terms of numbers. So you see the analytics for a certain journey, and they look pretty predictable. So you change or remove something and people act in a certain way. But on an individual level, behavior can be very, very unpredictable. And so it's also a matter of recognizing that it really depends on the context that people are, like these two Arsenal fans that were in the wrong side of the stands at a Chelsea match. So it's very important that to actually also recognize that in particular attitudes and actions depend on where you are and where you actually stand, which in this case wasn't optimal. And this translates basically in the attitude that people also have towards the service. The appearance matters. So if a company used Comic Sans to advertise the same message as another company that would just use nice, solid, sober Times New Roman, depending on the market, most people would probably go with the first rather than the second one, because in particular there's a lot of emotional aspects linked to, for example, banks and money and how is it actually handled from a customer's perspective. And so emotion is definitely one of the key drivers and for behavior, and it's one thing that cannot be underrated in terms of the research as well. And it's always useful to bring that to the fore when you're actually designing for services. Research is basically the only way that you can get to an empathy level for emotion, and emotions driving decisions means that you need to basically have that element if you want to influence the development of a good service for the end customer. So I would just really recommend, if you're working in that area, to look into persuasive models with some critical lens as well. But there are different ways that you can basically try to stimulate certain kind of behavior. So obviously cue action rewards was a popular psychological behavioral aspect model that is still quite often used in service design. Same thing with Fogg's behavioral model, although that's more about interaction, which basically it means you have to make things easier, but you also have to give people a reason to like to use the service. So give them a reward in some capacity, in a sense that you do something that's hard, you expect a bigger reward. You do something that's, like, for example, getting a thank you and maybe a voucher at the end of long process, a long journey, for instance. And that's something as well that only research can really scope out, and it's essential to understand how can we best adapt to giving people a better experience. And so I would definitely suggest as well that for journey maps, and in particular, if you're just thinking about the different phases of a journey, so basically from awareness to purchase to support to re-engagement for an e-commerce level, but for any kind of engagement on the product that you're working in, just to also take emotion into account, there are different ways that you can use it, and to use that sentiment as a way to become also more human-centric and showing that value to the other stakeholders. How people feel determines how they act. If you make a strong case on the basis of research for that project, there's a strong aspect of bringing it into an actual concrete set of improvements. And so it's very important as well that it's not assumptive and that it's grounded on data. And so there are different ways, of course, to measure emotional output and behavior. And it's one of the aspects that is more at the cutting edge of research, let's say. But even things like, for example, just having more attention to how people act, how they express themselves. You don't necessarily need to track biofeedback, so you don't need necessarily to have a heart rate and EEGs running on people to actually get the gist of how they feel. So these are meant to counter self-reported aspects, but always try to get that, even if you don't have any of the equipment necessary, to ask more questions, to dig in deeper, to actually get through satisfaction ratings, for example, to ask more questions about how did you feel about this specific part of the journey. And research is really the only way that a service can bring that information to focus. So I will just say, obviously, there are different pressures as well at the moment. So in terms of the automotive industry, this is very, very popular as well, but it's also a preparation for the future. So as more sensors, as more AI becomes pervasive, as more signals are drawn from our experience and our interactions with the environment and with technology in particular, that this will also become more important, that research will not just be about a single one way of doing things, but actually will take data sources from all sorts of places and all sorts of systems, and bringing it into focus is actually going to be one of the things where we're going to see that becoming more and more important for AI in particular. But also in terms of just the output, it's very important also to acknowledge that not everything needs to be designed for a massive change or a massive improvement. So if you're just looking at the UX design aspect, for example, it's clear that for some products and for some companies, they don't need a massive redevelopment change in the way that they design their interfaces. And this is perfectly fine as long as it's justified by continuous monitoring of what people are doing, and also how they prefer to act and use the system. So Spotify, Amazon are good examples of websites which have only evolved, or websites and apps that have evolved very slowly, only made subtle changes to the design over the years, but always with a view to introducing and minimizing friction. But also at the same time, they have an established user base that is used to working and using those apps in a specific way. So if you change too much around, there's friction that comes into play there as well. So that's also worthwhile to keep in mind, is that not everything needs a massive redesign. Sometimes it is about the small changes as well. And speaking of small and big changes, just in terms of, I had to also mention that obviously that AI is obviously going to be a huge game changer for the UX industry and service design in particular. But it's a long way from actually providing the holistic and understanding and view that in particular service design can provide, but also just the critical eye and creativity that comes with thinking about a complex problem and coming up with something innovative. Generative AI in particular is mostly about using big data sets in order to build something that is a response, for example, an essay, anything that you would ask of it. It's built on a specific set of data, and it's going to combine the data that it already knows rather than coming up with something absolutely new. This is something that we can only do from a human creativity perspective. And so it's very important to also push that awareness that service design, UX, and research work on levels of creativity and innovation that AI simply is not going to achieve at the moment. It's something that is inherently human and human-centered. So just to finalize, and I apologize for taking a bit longer with the talk, but just to finalize, the process itself is not as important as the mindset. The innovation that comes with service design and research can only work if there's more engagement with the stakeholders, more awareness, and bringing that into a flexible environment. It's usually innovation is translated into revolutionary outputs, but it's not about the methods. You can use any type of method as long as it works in the context of a team. And the bigger teams will have more systematic and more formal approaches, whereas smaller teams can get around to being much more dynamic and fluid in that. But good innovation can come from either way. It's just a matter of being flexible with that. And also that data from any source can be leveraged, but emotional data in particular builds empathy. It's something that will always speak to the stakeholders as well. And it's always the distinctive factor for decision-making and should always be in the mix, especially if you have research involved in service design. And so that's basically it. I just wanted to thank everybody for listening, and I'll be more than happy to take any questions that we have at the moment.
Thanks, Alberto. That was great and contained a lot of wealth of useful informations. I loved what you said about culture is as important as process. And the other thing which stayed with me is confidence and trust are the main drivers of the purchase. This can only be achieved through relevance and empathy. I think this is really great takeaways. Let me check. So if anyone has any questions, please submit them now. We have a little time left, so we can go maybe through one question if something comes up. Otherwise, I believe people can reach out on LinkedIn to you if they have something which pops to the mind after the talk. They can ask to you.
Yes, absolutely. So on screen you have my emails and also my LinkedIn, so feel free to connect. Looking forward to hearing from you if you want to ask questions or share knowledge. Happy to catch up afterwards.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I don't see any questions coming in now, so it's just that's all for now. And that's time for now what we have. Thanks everyone that tuned in. We'll have the recordings available for you tomorrow. So keep an eye on your emails when it pops up in your inbox. We have come to the end of this session, which was also the last session of Interact Amsterdam Virtual Conference 2023. Thank you for all joining, and see you at the next conference in 2024. Thanks for joining. Bye. Have a nice evening.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Bye.